The gunshot echoed through the courtroom as Florence Foster pointed a trembling finger at Silas Blackwater, the notorious gang leader who'd terrorized half of Colorado Territory. "That's him," she declared, her voice steadier than her hands. "That's the man who killed Sheriff Jensen and robbed the Wells Fargo coach last spring." Little did she know those words would set her on a desperate flight across the frontier, with only a stranger's promise standing between her and certain death. Montana Territory, 1876. Florence clutched the torn edges of her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the stagecoach rattled over the rough terrain. 3 months had passed since she'd testified against Blackwater and his gang, but it felt like yesterday. The judge had promised her protection, but 2 days ago, a U.S. Marshal had arrived at her boarding house in Denver with grave news: Blackwater's men had escaped custody during transfer, killing 2 guards in the process. "They've made it clear they're coming for you, Miss Foster," the marshal had said, pressing a small pouch of money into her palm. "You need to disappear." So here she was, heading north to a place she'd never heard of, Wallace, Idaho Territory, supposedly a small mining settlement tucked away in the mountains where no one would think to look for her. Florence had left behind the modest life she'd built for herself after her father's passing 2 years prior. At 25, she had worked as a schoolteacher in Denver, finding solace in educating young minds after witnessing the brutal stagecoach robbery that had changed everything. The stagecoach jolted to a halt, throwing Florence forward against the opposite bench. "End of the line, madam," the driver called down. "Wallace Station's just yonder." Florence peered out the small window. Wallace was barely a town, a single muddy street lined with hastily constructed wooden buildings. Miners in dirt-caked clothes ambled between saloons and boarding houses. The mountains loomed on all sides, making her feel both trapped and hidden. The driver helped her down, handed over her single valise, and pointed toward a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read Wallace Hotel and Boarding. "Best place for a lady to stay," he offered before climbing back onto his perch. Florence had taken no more than 10 steps toward the hotel when she noticed 3 men on horseback entering the far end of town. Something about their purposeful pace made her blood run cold. One of them, a man with a red bandana, looked eerily familiar. When he turned his head in her direction, she froze in recognition. Abe Donner, one of Blackwater's most loyal men, the same man who'd sat sneering at her throughout the trial. They'd found her already. Florence ducked behind a stack of mining equipment, heart hammering. How had they tracked her so quickly? She needed to run, but where? She knew no one here, and the stagecoach was already disappearing down the road. "You look like you're in a spot of trouble, madam." The voice behind her nearly caused her to scream. Florence whirled around to find herself face to face with a tall man in dusty trail clothes. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see keen eyes studying her with unsettling intensity. "I'm fine," she lied, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall. The stranger glanced past her toward the 3 riders who were now dismounting outside the saloon. "Those men looking for you," Florence stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Madam, I've been riding these territories long enough to recognize someone on the run." His voice dropped lower. "And those men have the look of hunters, not travelers." A shout from the direction of the saloon made her flinch. One of the men was showing something to the bartender, likely a sketch of her face. "Please," she whispered, desperation winning out over caution. "I need to leave town. Now." The stranger considered her for a long moment before nodding once. "Name's Vaughn Alderman. I've got a ranch about 4 hours' ride from here." "I can pay," Florence began, reaching for the pouch of money. "That won't be necessary." Vaughn touched the brim of his hat. "Wait here, don't move." Before Florence could protest, he strode casually toward the stables across the street. She watched as he spoke briefly with the stable hand, then disappeared inside. Minutes later, which felt like hours to Florence, he emerged leading 2 horses, a chestnut mare and a sturdy black gelding. Instead of coming directly back to her, Vaughn headed toward the general store, tied the horses, and went inside. Through the window, she could see him gathering supplies. All the while, Florence remained frozen in her hiding spot, acutely aware that Blackwater's men were methodically making their way down the street, asking questions at each establishment. When Vaughn finally returned, he carried a bundle of cloth. "Put this on," he said, handing her a worn duster coat and a hat similar to his own. "Pull the hat low and keep your head down. We're going to walk these horses to the edge of town nice and casual-like, then ride hard once we're clear." Florence's hands trembled as she donned the disguise. "How do I know I can trust you?" Something resembling a smile flickered across Vaughn's face. "You don't. But right now, I'm offering the only chance you've got." He was right. With no alternatives, Florence allowed him to help her onto the chestnut mare. They led the horses slowly down a side alley, emerging on the outskirts of town without encountering Blackwater's men. "Keep close," Vaughn instructed as they mounted up. "The trail gets rough, and we need to make good time before nightfall." As they rode away from Wallace, Florence cast one final glance back at the town. In the distance, she could see the 3 riders gathered in front of the hotel, their postures tense with frustration. A shiver ran down her spine. "They won't find you where we're going," Vaughn said, noticing her backward glance. "My ranch is tucked away in a valley few people know exists." Florence wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or terrified by that prospect. But as they urged their horses into a gallop, she had no choice but to trust this stranger and the promise of sanctuary he offered. They rode hard through the afternoon, following game trails and shallow creek beds rather than the main road. Vaughn seemed to know every hidden path in the wilderness, guiding them deeper into the mountains with unwavering confidence. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, pine forests giving way to steep, rocky slopes before descending into lush valleys. "How much farther?" Florence called as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. Her body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. "Not far now," Vaughn replied without slowing. "There's a ridge up ahead. Once we cross it, we'll be in my valley." True to his word, they crested a rocky ridge just as the sky bloomed with sunset colors. Below them stretched a verdant valley cradled between mountain walls. A log cabin stood near a small creek, smoke curling from its chimney. Nearby, a corral and barn completed the modest homestead. "Someone's there," Florence said, alarmed by the smoke. "Just my ranch hand, Pedro. He's trustworthy." Vaughn led the way down the steep trail. "He keeps things running when I'm away on cattle drives." As they approached the cabin, an older Mexican man emerged, waving in greeting. He took the reins of their horses as they dismounted. "Señor Vaughn, you return early," he remarked, his curious gaze moving to Florence. "We have a guest, Pedro, miss." Vaughn paused, realizing they hadn't properly introduced themselves. Florence Foster," she supplied, wincing as she stretched her sore muscles. "Miss Foster will be staying with us for a while," Vaughn continued. "She needs a safe place to rest." Understanding passed between the 2 men. Pedro nodded solemnly. "The spare room is ready. I will bring water for washing." Vaughn gestured toward the cabin door. "It's not much, but it's secure. Come inside." The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, solid wooden furniture, and bookshelves lined with volumes that suggested Vaughn Alderman was more than just a simple rancher. A pot of something savory simmered over the fire, filling the space with a welcoming aroma. "You can have the back room," Vaughn said, pointing to a door off the main area. "It's small but private." Florence stood awkwardly in the center of the room, still wearing the oversized duster. Now that they had stopped moving, the reality of her situation crashed over her. She had fled with a complete stranger to a remote mountain valley, with killers hunting her. The enormity of it made her legs weak. Vaughn must have noticed her distress, for his expression softened. "Sit down before you fall down, Miss Foster. You're safe here, I promise you that." "How can you be so certain?" she asked, sinking into a chair by the fire. "Those men, they're dangerous. They've killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again." "Because few people know this valley exists," he explained, pouring her a cup of coffee from the pot on the hearth. "It's not on any maps. The only way in is the trail we took, and I keep a close watch on that approach." He handed her the steaming cup. "Besides, I'm not unfamiliar with handling dangerous men." Something in his tone made Florence look at him more closely. In the firelight, she could see a thin scar running along his jawline, and his hands, though clean, bore the calluses of both ranch work and something else, the distinctive marks of a man accustomed to handling firearms regularly. "Who are you really, Mr. Alderman?" she asked quietly. He considered her question for a moment before answering. "I was a scout for the Union Army during the war, then rode with the territorial marshals for a few years after. These days, I prefer the quiet life." His eyes met hers directly. "But I still know how to protect what's mine." "I'm not yours to protect," Florence said automatically. That almost smile appeared again. "No, madam, you're not, but my ranch is, and while you're on it, you'll be safe." He stood, removing his hat. "Now Pedro will bring you water to wash up, and there's stew for supper. We can talk more after you've rested." With that, he left her alone by the fire, stepping outside to help Pedro with the horses. Florence sipped the strong coffee, her mind whirling with questions about the man who had just risked himself to save a stranger. True to Vaughn's word, Pedro brought a basin of steaming water and clean towels to the small bedroom. Florence was grateful for the chance to wash away the dust of travel. The room was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the creek. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, an unexpected touch of beauty in this rugged place. When she emerged for supper, Vaughn and Pedro were already seated at the table. The meal was simple but filling: venison stew, cornbread, and coffee. They ate mostly in silence, Florence too exhausted for conversation. Afterward, Pedro retired to his quarters in the barn, leaving her alone with Vaughn. "You should get some rest," he suggested, clearing the dishes. "Morning comes early here." "Mr. Alderman," Florence began, "I appreciate your help today, but I can't stay here indefinitely. Those men won't give up looking for me." Vaughn leaned against the edge of the table, regarding her thoughtfully. "Why are they hunting you, Miss Foster, if you don't mind my asking?" Florence hesitated. She had kept the full story to herself for so long, sharing only what was necessary with the authorities. But something about Vaughn's steady gaze encouraged trust. "I witnessed them murder a sheriff and rob a Wells Fargo coach outside of Denver," she began. "I was traveling to visit my aunt when our stagecoach came upon the scene. The sheriff had apparently tried to intervene in the robbery and paid with his life." She closed her eyes briefly, the memory still vivid. "Most passengers were too afraid to come forward, but my father raised me to believe in justice, so I testified at the trial. Silas Blackwater and 2 of his gang were sentenced to hang, but the others escaped. Now they've broken Blackwater out during transfer and—" Her voice faltered. "And they want revenge," Vaughn finished for her. Florence nodded. The marshal who helped me escape Denver said they've put a price on my head among outlaws, dead or alive. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. Well, then you'll stay here until it's safe. This valley has hidden me when I needed hiding. It'll do the same for you. But your ranch, your life, I can't ask you to risk that. You didn't ask, Miss Foster. I offered. He straightened up, his decision evidently made. Get some sleep. Things often look clearer in the morning light. As Florence lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the mountain wind and the distant howl of wolves, she wondered about the man sleeping in the next room. What had led Vaughn Alderman to this isolated valley? What ghosts was he hiding from in this wilderness sanctuary? And how long would it be before Blackwater's men tracked them here? Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, punctuated by nightmares of pursuing riders and courtroom confrontations. When she finally rose at dawn, she felt hardly rested at all. She found Vaughn already at work outside, splitting firewood with powerful strokes of an axe. Florence paused in the doorway, watching him for a moment. In the clear morning light, she could better see the man who had become her protector. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with streaks of silver at his temples. His movements were economical and precise, suggesting a lifetime of physical labor and discipline. When he noticed her watching, he paused, embedding the axe in the chopping block. "Morning," he called. "Coffee's hot inside. Pedro's made flapjacks." The day established what would become their routine in the weeks that followed. Florence insisted on earning her keep, taking over household duties while the men tended to ranch work. She discovered that Vaughn ran a modest cattle operation, with a small herd grazing in the upper meadows during summer. On her third day, Vaughn brought her a rifle. "Can you shoot?" he asked, holding out the Winchester. Florence took it cautiously. "My father taught me with his old squirrel gun." "Nothing this size." "Then we'd best practice." He led her to a makeshift range behind the barn, setting up cans on a fallen log. "If trouble comes, I want you prepared." They spent an hour each day after that with Florence learning to handle the rifle with increasing confidence. Vaughn proved a patient teacher, his hands occasionally covering hers to adjust her grip or stance. Each time he touched her, Florence felt a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun beating down on them. As days turned into weeks, Florence found herself settling into life in the valley. The constant fear that had been her companion since the trial began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of security. She expanded the vegetable garden behind the cabin, started baking bread in the old iron stove, and even began reading aloud in the evenings from Vaughn's surprisingly extensive library. For his part, Vaughn gradually revealed more of himself through their conversations. He had fought at Shiloh and Vicksburg before being recruited as a scout. After the war, finding himself unable to return to his family's farm in Virginia, now burned and confiscated, he had drifted west, working as a marshal until a particular case left him disillusioned with justice. "What happened?" Florence asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold. Vaughn was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I tracked a man for 3 months, he finally said. "A killer who'd murdered a family near Cheyenne. When I finally brought him in, the territorial judge let him go. Turned out he was the nephew of a railroad baron with political connections." His hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "I found the man celebrating his release in a saloon that night. Words were exchanged. Shots were fired." He glanced at her. "I left town with a bullet in my shoulder and a price on my head, not unlike yourself." "What happened to the man?" Florence asked quietly. "He's dead." The simple statement hung in the air between them. The charges were eventually dropped when witnesses came forward, but by then, I'd found this place and decided I preferred solitude to so-called civilization. Florence absorbed this revelation, understanding now why he had been so willing to help her. They were kindred spirits in a way, both forced into hiding by their commitment to justice. As summer began to wane, Florence realized with some surprise that she had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months. The nightmares came less frequently now, and she had developed a comfortable familiarity with both the valley and its inhabitants. One morning, Vaughn announced he needed to make a supply run to the nearest trading post. "It's a full day's ride," he explained. "I'll be back tomorrow evening." Florence felt an unexpected pang of anxiety at the thought of him leaving, even briefly. "Is it safe? Pedro will be here, and he's handier with a gun than he looks," Vaughn assured her. "Besides, there's been no sign of trouble. I think we're well clear of Blackwater's reach by now." She helped him prepare for the journey, packing food for the trail and making a list of needed supplies. As he mounted up to leave, Florence impulsively reached for his hand. "Be careful," she said, surprising herself with the depth of concern in her voice. Vaughn's fingers tightened around hers for a moment. "Always am." Then he was gone, riding up the trail that led out of the valley. The day passed slowly without him. Florence busied herself with chores, trying not to watch the ridge for his return. That night she found it difficult to sleep, the cabin seeming emptier somehow without Vaughn's reassuring presence. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Florence was in the garden harvesting late summer vegetables when Pedro approached, his expression grave. "Riders coming," he said quietly. 3 men, heavily armed. Florence's blood ran cold. "Blackwater's men," Pedro shook his head. "Cannot tell from here. They follow Senor Vaughn's trail." "What should we do?" Florence fought to keep panic at bay. "Get inside. Take the rifle." Pedro checked the revolver at his hip. "I will meet them. If there is trouble, use the escape tunnel." "Tunnel?" This was the first she'd heard of such a thing. Pedro nodded toward the cabin. "In your room under the bed. The rug hides a trapdoor. It leads to a cave behind the waterfall. Senor Vaughn showed you the waterfall." Florence nodded, remembering their walk along the creek weeks ago. "Go now," Pedro urged. "And be ready." Florence retreated to the cabin, her heart pounding. She retrieved the Winchester from the rack by the door and checked that it was loaded, just as Vaughn had taught her. Through the window, she watched Pedro position himself casually by the corral, as though merely going about his daily chores. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Finally, the riders appeared, descending the ridge trail at a measured pace. Florence's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man in front, Abe Donner, with his distinctive red bandana. Flanking him were 2 rough-looking men she didn't recognize. They approached Pedro, who stood his ground, one hand resting near his holstered gun. Florence couldn't hear their exchange, but she could see Pedro shake his head several times. Donner leaned forward in his saddle, gesturing emphatically, his posture becoming more threatening. One of the other riders suddenly pointed toward the cabin, spotting movement at the window. Florence ducked down, but it was too late. They'd seen her. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the air. Florence peered over the windowsill to see Pedro falling, clutching his shoulder. The riders were spurring their horses toward the cabin. Florence's training took over. She positioned herself at the window, braced the rifle, and fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt at the lead horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. "That's her," Donner shouted. "That's the Foster woman." The men dismounted, using their horses for cover as they drew their weapons. Bullets splintered the window frame above Florence's head. She returned fire, forcing them to keep their distance, but she knew she was outnumbered and outgunned. "You might as well give up, Florence," Donner called. "Blackwater wants you alive," but he'll settle for dead if that's how you want it." Florence didn't respond, conserving her ammunition. Where was Vaughn? Had they encountered him on the trail? The thought that he might be lying dead somewhere made her stomach clench with dread. A movement caught her eye. Pedro was crawling toward the barn, leaving a trail of blood behind him. One of Donner's men noticed too and took aim. Florence fired quickly, her shot going wide but distracting the man long enough for Pedro to reach the shelter of the barn door. "Burn her out," Donner ordered. One of his men produced a bottle filled with liquid, stuffing a rag into its neck. Florence realized she had no choice. She needed to reach the tunnel. Keeping low, she backed toward her room, maintaining her aim at the window. Once inside, she shoved the heavy chest of drawers in front of the door for what little protection it might provide, then dropped to her knees beside the bed. Sure enough, pulling back the braided rug revealed a trapdoor set into the floorboards. Florence could smell smoke now they had set fire to the porch. With shaking hands, she lifted the trapdoor, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The sound of breaking glass came from the main room, followed by a whoosh of flames. With no time to waste, Florence slung the rifle over her shoulder and began climbing down the ladder, pulling the trapdoor closed above her. The tunnel was narrow and roughly hewn, forcing her to crouch as she moved forward by feel in the pitch darkness. The air was damp and cold after the warmth of the cabin, and her progress was slowed by the need to avoid stumbling in the blackness. After what seemed like an eternity, Florence saw a faint light ahead. The tunnel widened slightly, the rough walls giving way to natural stone. The sound of falling water grew louder as she approached the exit, which was partially concealed behind the cascade Vaughn had shown her on one of their walks. Florence paused at the edge of the cave, peering through the curtain of water. She could see no sign of Donner or his men, but smoke was rising from the direction of the cabin. Her heart ached at the thought of Vaughn returning to find his home destroyed if he returned at all. Gathering her courage, Florence slipped through the waterfall, the cold spray drenching her instantly. She scrambled down the rocky slope beside the falls, seeking cover in the dense undergrowth that lined the creek. Her plan was to make her way upstream, away from the cabin and hopefully to a vantage point where she could assess the situation. She had gone perhaps half a mile, moving as quietly as possible through the forest when she heard horses approaching. Florence pressed herself against the trunk of a massive pine, raising the rifle with trembling hands. The first rider came into view, Vaughn, urging his horse at a dangerous pace along the creek bank, his face set in grim determination. Relief flooded through Florence so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "Vaughn," she called, stepping out from her hiding place. He reined in sharply, disbelief and then overwhelming relief washing over his features. In one fluid motion, he dismounted and crossed to her, his hands gripping her shoulders as if to confirm she was real. "Florence," he breathed. "Thank God, I saw the smoke from the ridge." His eyes scanned her quickly for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Pedro is wounded." "And the cabin?" "Pedro made it to the trading post," Vaughn said. "He's the one who warned me. Doctor's tending to him now." His expression hardened. "Blackwater's men, 3 of them, led by Donner." Florence's voice shook slightly. "They set fire to the cabin. I escaped through the tunnel." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he instructed, checking his revolver. "I'll handle this." "No," Florence caught his arm. "There are 3 of them, Vaughn. We need to leave, get help." "This ends now," he said with quiet intensity. "I'm tired of running, and I expect you are too." Before she could argue further, the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees. Splinters flew from the pine beside them. Vaughn shoved Florence down behind a fallen log, returning fire in the direction of the shot. "It's just one of them," he murmured. They've split up to search for you." Another shot rang out closer this time. Vaughn fired twice in response, then ducked down beside Florence. "When I give the word, run to my horse and mount up," he instructed. "Head back toward the trading post. Don't stop for anything." "I won't leave you," Florence protested. Vaughn's expression softened momentarily. "I need to know you're safe." A movement in the trees caught Florence's attention. "Vaughn, behind you," he whirled just as a man emerged from the brush, pistol aimed. Florence raised her rifle and fired without thinking. The man staggered, clutching his chest, then collapsed to the ground. Silence fell over the forest. Vaughn gave Florence a long look that contained both approval and something deeper, unspoken. "That leaves two," he said finally, "and they'll have heard the shots." As if in confirmation, shouts came from the direction of the cabin. Donner's voice carried clearly through the trees. "This way, by the creek." "Change of plan," Vaughn said, helping Florence to her feet. "We make for the upper meadow. I have a cache of supplies in the line shack there. We can hold out if necessary." Together they moved swiftly through the forest, climbing steadily away from the creek. The terrain grew steeper, forcing them to scramble over rocks and fallen trees. Florence's lungs burned with exertion, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their pursuers weren't far behind. They had nearly reached the edge of the tree line when gunfire erupted from below. Bullets whined overhead, splintering bark from nearby pines. Vaughn returned fire, providing cover as Florence continued upward. "Almost there," he encouraged, motioning toward a small, weathered structure barely visible among the rocks above. "The line shack. Go." Florence sprinted the final distance, reaching the crude wooden door just as Vaughn fired his last shot. He was right behind her as she threw the door open and stumbled inside. The shack was little more than a single room with a dirt floor, but its walls were solid logs, and the single window had heavy shutters. Vaughn immediately barred the door and began gathering weapons from a trunk in the corner, another rifle, boxes of ammunition, and even a few sticks of dynamite. "Cattle rustlers used to be a problem up here," he explained, seeing Florence's questioning look at the arsenal. "I came prepared." They took positions at opposite sides of the shack, Florence at the window, Vaughn near a small firing port beside the door. Outside, the afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the meadow. "How did they find us?" Florence asked, keeping her voice low. Vaughn shook his head. "Pedro said they were asking questions at every settlement within 50 miles. Must have gotten lucky at the trading post, followed my trail back." "I'm sorry about your cabin," Florence said, guilt washing over her. "All of this is because of me." "Buildings can be rebuilt," Vaughn replied simply. He glanced at her. "You're a good shot. Where did you learn?" "My father," she said. "He believed a woman alone needed to protect herself." She smiled faintly. "Though I never imagined using those skills quite like this." Vaughn was about to respond when movement at the edge of the meadow caught their attention. Donner and his remaining man emerged from the trees, approaching cautiously, using the tall grass for cover. "Foster," Donner shouted. "We know you're in there. Come out now and maybe your friend lives." Florence and Vaughn exchanged glances. "Don't answer," Vaughn mouthed. Donner tried again. "Blackwater just wants to talk, Florence. Clear up this misunderstanding." At this, Florence couldn't contain a bitter laugh. "Misunderstanding? I watched him murder a lawman in cold blood." "Your choice," Donner called back. "Hard way it is." The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Donner and his companion attempted to approach the shack from different angles, but the open meadow gave them little cover. Vaughn's marksmanship proved deadly. The second man fell with a clean shot to the chest, leaving only Donner. As darkness fell, an uneasy silence descended. Donner had retreated to the tree line, wounded but still dangerous. "He'll wait for night, then try to burn us out like they did the cabin," Vaughn predicted, reloading his weapons methodically. Florence's thoughts raced. "The dynamite," she suggested. "Could we use it somehow?" Vaughn considered this. Possibly, but we'd need to draw him close enough. He was quiet for a moment, then turned to Florence with a determined expression. "I have an idea, but you won't like it." The plan was risky but simple. As Vaughn explained it, Florence felt a growing dread, but she recognized its logic. When darkness had fully claimed the meadow, they put it into action. Florence slipped out the back of the shack, while Vaughn created a distraction at the front, firing several shots toward Donner's last known position. Keeping low in the tall grass, Florence circled wide, positioning herself behind the tree line where Donner had taken cover. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered brilliantly across the sky. Florence moved as silently as possible, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. When she reached the trees, she paused, listening intently. A twig snapped to her right, followed by labored breathing. Donner, wounded and growing desperate, Florence raised her rifle, waiting for the signal. Inside the shack, Vaughn had placed the dynamite near the door, with a long fuse running inside where he could light it when the time came. "Foster," Vaughn's voice rang out, playing his part. "I'm sending the woman out. This isn't my fight." Florence tensed, knowing what came next. "Smart move, mister," Donner called back, shifting position. Florence could see his silhouette now, moving toward the edge of the trees, focused entirely on the shack. "Come out slow, Florence, hands up." Vaughn continued, giving Florence the signal they'd agreed upon. Donner stepped further into the open, pistol trained on the shack door. Florence took careful aim, just as Vaughn had taught her during those long practice sessions behind the barn. She exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the meadow. Donner jerked but remained standing, wounded again but not fatally. He whirled in Florence's direction, firing wildly into the darkness. She ducked behind a tree trunk as bullets splintered the bark around her. From the shack, Vaughn opened fire, drawing Donner's attention back toward the building. The outlaw, now caught between two shooters and bleeding heavily, made a desperate decision. He charged toward the shack, intent on reaching the door. "Now, Vaughn," Florence shouted. A small flame appeared in the window of the shack, Vaughn lighting the fuse. Seconds later, he burst through the door, diving to one side as Donner fired at him. Vaughn rolled and came up shooting, hitting Donner in the leg. The outlaw stumbled but kept coming, rage and desperation driving him forward. "Get clear," Vaughn shouted to Florence, scrambling away from the shack. The explosion ripped through the night, the concussion knocking Florence to the ground. When she looked up, the shack was engulfed in flames and a still figure lay sprawled nearby Donner, caught in the blast. Vaughn appeared through the smoke, rushing to Florence's side. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, helping her to her feet. She shook her head, unable to speak as reaction set in. Vaughn pulled her close, his arms steady around her trembling body. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "It's finally over." They stood together watching the shack burn, the heat warming their faces in the cool mountain night. Florence felt something shift inside her, a weight lifting. A door closing on one chapter of her life and opening on another. Dawn found them making their slow way back down to the valley. The cabin was a charred ruin, but the barn still stood, and miraculously the small garden Florence had tended remained untouched by the fire. "We'll rebuild," Vaughn said simply, surveying the damage. "Better than before." Florence looked at him in surprise. "We." Vaughn turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Unless you're planning to leave now that the danger's past." The question hung between them. Florence thought about the life she had left behind in Denver, her small room in the boarding house, the schoolhouse where she had taught. It seemed like a different lifetime ago, belonging to a different woman. "I have nothing to go back to," she admitted. "Everything I cared about was destroyed or left behind when I fled." "And is there anything here worth staying for?" Vaughn asked quietly. Florence met his gaze steadily. "Yes," she said. "I believe there is." The rebuilding began that very day. Word was sent to the trading post for supplies and to check on Pedro's recovery. Within a week, the framework of a new cabin began to take shape, larger and sturdier than the original. Neighbors from distant ranches, hearing of their troubles, rode in to help with the construction, turning what could have been months of work into mere weeks. Pedro returned, his arm in a sling but his spirit undimmed. "I knew you would defeat those bandidos," he told Florence proudly. "You have the heart of a warrior." As summer gave way to autumn, the new cabin was completed just in time for the first snowfall. Florence had made it truly a home, adding touches that blended her sensibilities with Vaughn's practical nature: curtains at the windows, bookshelves filled with both their collections, a larger kitchen where she could teach him the recipes her mother had passed down. Their relationship evolved gradually, built on the foundation of mutual respect forged in danger. The first kiss came one evening as they sat before the new hearth, discussing plans for spring planting. It was gentle and questioning at first, then deepening as Florence leaned into him, answering his unspoken question with certainty. "I've wanted to do that since I found you by the creek that day," Vaughn confessed, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Why did you wait so long?" Florence asked, smiling. "I needed to be sure you were staying because you wanted to, not because you had nowhere else to go." Florence silenced his doubts with another kiss. "I'm exactly where I want to be." Winter settled over the valley, wrapping the ranch in a blanket of pristine white. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside, Vaughn presented Florence with a simple gold band. "I'm not one for flowery speeches," he said, taking her hand. "But I know what I want, Florence Foster. A life with you right here in this valley if you'll have me." Florence's answer was immediate and certain. Yes. They were married in the spring, with Pedro and a handful of neighboring ranchers as witnesses. The territorial judge who performed the ceremony also delivered news Silas Blackwater had been killed in a prison escape attempt. The last threat to Florence's safety was gone. "Seems fitting," Vaughn remarked later as they walked along the creek where they had fought for their lives less than a year before. "A new beginning all around." Florence squeezed his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" Taking in a stranger that day in Wallace, Vaughn stopped, turning to face her. Not for a single moment. His hand rested gently on her stomach where the first signs of their child had begun to show. "Everything I have that matters came from that decision." As the years passed, the Alderman ranch prospered. They added a second story to the cabin as their family grew, first a son, then twin daughters 2 years later. Florence established a small school for their children and those of neighboring ranchers. Vaughn's cattle operation expanded, his reputation for fair dealing bringing buyers from as far as Boise and Helena. Occasionally, travelers would pass through the valley, sometimes staying a night or two before moving on. Florence always watched them carefully at first, old habits dying hard. But as time distanced her from the events that had brought her to the valley, the vigilance gradually eased. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Vaughn surprised Florence with a journey back to Wallace. The small mining town had grown considerably, with proper streets and established businesses replacing the hasty structures she remembered. "Hardly recognize it," Vaughn commented as they walked arm in arm down the main street. Florence nodded, memories washing over her. It's strange to think how terrified I was that day, how certain I was that my life was ending, not beginning. They stopped in front of what had been the spot where she had hidden behind mining equipment, where a stranger had offered refuge when she needed it most. "They won't find you here," Vaughn quoted his words from that day, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes, now lined with a decade of Idaho weather and honest laughter. "I believe that promise has been kept." Florence reached up to touch his face, still handsome despite the silver that now dominated his temples. "The best promise anyone ever made to me." That evening, as they prepared to return to their ranch, to their children being cared for by a now elderly Pedro, and his niece Florence stood on the hotel balcony, looking out over the town that had once represented her greatest fear. "Any regrets?" Vaughn asked, joining her with 2 glasses of champagne, a luxury they rarely indulged in. Florence considered the question seriously. She thought of the teaching position she had abandoned, the modest life she had been building in Denver. Then she thought of their thriving ranch, their beautiful children, the community they had built in their remote valley, and the love that had grown from desperation and courage into something unshakable and true. "Not a single one," she answered, raising her glass to his. "Every step of the journey brought me exactly where I was meant to be." As they rode home the next day, Florence looked ahead to the mountain pass that would lead them back to their valley. The journey that had begun in terror had led to a life fuller and richer than she could have imagined when she stepped off that stagecoach in Wallace all those years ago. "Race you to the ridge," she called to Vaughn, spurring her horse forward with the same spirit that had helped her survive when hunted, that had given her the courage to build a new life, that had opened her heart to love when she least expected it. Vaughn laughed and urged his mount after her, the sound echoing across the landscape that had become not just a hiding place, but a home,